Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris. I'm a bookseller at Boswell Book Company. If you didn't know that, now you know me. And I have a few things to tell you. First of all, today is day 4,192 that Boswell has been a bookstore, virtual otherwise. I'm really excited to welcome Salar Abdoh. He's the author of The Poet Game, Opium, Tehran, Twilight, editor and translator of Tehran Noir, director also of the graduate program in creative writing at City College of New York, CUNY, and he's here to discuss his novel, Out of Mesopotamia. I absolutely love this novel. It's one of my favorite of the fall. And there's been a lot of great press, really great New York Times review, and many really great reviews. But let me tell you what I thought of it. So I'm going to quote my own here. Abdoh's novel reinvigorates the way we write about war, a book that struggles and meditates to understand why do we choose to bloody our hands. And the answers here are many, uneasy, and contradictory. And the book riffs on the Western canon of war, the adrift disillusionment of Hemingway, the absurdity and commerce of Catch-22. Out of Mesopotamia is nothing less than profound. So enough from me. Let me turn it over. Meg, Salar, welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris, very much.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody. Normally, Salar and I would be sitting in front of a bunch of books at Boswell, having a really nice chat, looking out all of you guys sitting in nice, comfy chairs. But this is a different world that we're living in now. So normally, I would ask people for a raise of hands who had already read the book. And I'd always say no judging, but let's just assume that some of you have not read the book. So Salar, I wanted to ask you to could you summarize your book, kind of describe what your book is about?
Sure. The book essentially is about a journalist, an Iranian journalist who does a lot of things, who is a writer, and he does art reviews, he writes for the film industry in Tehran, and he's deep in the literary world, but he also gets pulled into the war in Syria and Iraq and sort of finds an alternate life there in combat. And this back and forth between his home life and his life on the front lines with the combatants, with the warriors and the martyrs to be, which he writes about extensively, is essentially the novel. And that sort of a war in the 21st century, what it entails with social media and the crossing of the various cultures.
Great, Salar. Did you want to start off with, did you want to read a passage or anything to folks first off to kind of give people an insight in what your writing's about? And then I've got a bunch of questions I want to ask you.
Sure. Because I hadn't I'm going to read a passage that I have read before, only because it's a passage, it's short enough and it stands on its own, and it really sort of captures many things, what really war feels like when not necessarily in combat, those landscapes, and how this person feels in that landscape. As I've mentioned before, there's just one word here that you need to know. It's an Arabic word that's called mokeb. It's basically a place where warriors and combatants and soldiers rest, or pilgrims, when they're taking a rest from whatever they're doing and they get fed and just relax for a while. So you'll come across that word. So this is from chapter 12. The countryside was a flat nothingness. Occasionally on parallel dirt roads, a dot moved and we didn't know if the thing was ours or not. Nothing was taken for granted in victory because victory had been here before, and it always managed to slip away like fish or happiness. We drove in 3 trucks, hardened men who breathed retribution and the diesel stench of war, and loved it. I sat in front next to the cleric, taking in the murderous smoke of cigarettes that only he and I seemed not to care for. The vehicles putrid with a staleness that is indescribable. If I survived, I would live out my life remembering hours such as this, when breathing seemed pointless. My eyes tried and failed to catch the distances where a drone, a plane, a gunship, an enemy suicide truck, a friendly, or really any motherfucker at all who could spook you out of your melancholy might suddenly emerge. But my eyes were lemons, God-given failures that mostly just guessed at the things men spoke of when they pointed into distances and felt for the placement of their weapons. Names, everywhere there were names, so many combatants and hangers-on and lost souls treading the dying misfortune of Mesopotamia, that one got lost in the maze of titles and martyrs and those waiting in line. I had developed a fear of returning to the place where war was at a respite or non-existent. Though dangerous, Tel Abdoh was still a few kilometers too far away from the action. I would rather go back to our mocap and wait for the enemy to strike again. It would have been suicide on their part to hit us once more, but suicide was their stuff of life. And somehow I held the unreasonable faith that if only I stayed at the mocap long enough, all the dead would return as if they were ghosts on a catwalk.
Well, that brings up my first question, Salar. You know, martyrdom and martyrs are a part of your book and are a part of the war in the Middle East. And yet for Americans and Westerners, that is such a martyrdom is such a foreign concept. And I have to go back to World War II when the Americans were just shocked, and when the kamikaze pilots would fly their planes into ships, and Americans we can't really quite wrap our heads around people flying jumbo jets into the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, why do people want to become martyrs, and what does martyrdom play? What role does martyrdom play in the war that's going on now and in the Middle East in general?
Very good question, Meg. Martyrdom in this sense is less about like these men going to war, is less about being kamikaze-like or, you know, suicide attackers, but more as people who go to war to protect the things they believe in. And then if they get killed, they become part of that whole cosmology and built world of martyrdom that's as part and parcel of, in a way, Shiite Islam especially, but, you know, the greater religion. Yeah. Why they do it in this particular war was for many reasons, as you and I talked about the other day. The man that I was with going from Iran, some of them felt that this war was about the protection of the holy sites of Islam, but specifically the Shia sites that were being desecrated by ISIS. But also, there's been a sense in a place like Iran. Iran fought a long, hard-fought war in the 1980s, 8 years of war, and it wasn't just against Iraq. It was like sort of Iran against the world, and a million people got killed, and it was a pretty awful war. As far, it was like World War I scale kind of war of attrition, but there was a lot of brotherhood in it. There was a lot of sense of purpose, and a lot of these men who would practically sell everything. I've seen men just pack up and go, just sell every last thing they have, just so they can get across the border and do their duty. they wanted, a lot of these guys wanted to recapture, because they're of a new generation, they wanted to recapture that sense of, I guess, purpose and brotherhood, and sometimes sisterhood as well. I've seen that has been lost. In one of his books, Sebastian Junger actually talks about that. I think it's in the book Tribe. He talks about, it's only in combat, really, in the modern world, that you feel that sense of urgency, where the guy next to you will give you his all, and you will give your all to him. And I also have written about that in essays. I have an essay about, why the moment where I, as a writer and a journalist, felt like I would take a bullet for that person over there because of a number of reasons. So it's also because of that. And also the last reason is because in these geographies, sometimes there are not a whole lot of options. That's another truth, like if you're wherever in Qom or Mashhad or Shiraz or Tehran or any of the cities in Iraq, and you don't have a job, and you're not necessarily going to get paid a lot of times doing this, maybe just fed and clothed. But there's something to be said about to go there and do this thing that makes a hero out of you, in a way. And that's sort of that culture of hero worship, which in these places translates itself as the culture of martyrdom. As I've said before, is not that different from the culture of hero worship here in the United States. They have the same qualities, but also major differences in their manifestations.
Yep. Next thing I wanted to ask you, that the protagonist of your book is a war correspondent, but also a journalist back home in Tehran. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, because your protagonist kind of wrestles with, do I cross the line and actually fighting instead of just observing? And what do you think some war correspondents want to cross that line and fight instead of just reporting? And can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
It's a hard thing to talk about because you don't want to talk about all war correspondence, especially when it comes to, I live in the West and I live in the East, and I've known war correspondents such as yourself. There's a definite division of labor here, which, like everything in Western society, often for the better, you do that thing that you're supposed to do. But I've had many, particularly war photographers in Iran, friends, who also follow that path. But for others like me, who are perhaps not necessarily professional journalists, I've done that. But I'm a writer and sort of somebody who embeds themselves in the things of life. That border can become very murky when things are so close to home, and when it's really almost, again, I've talked about this, going back and forth between, some of these towns in Iraq back to Tehran. These are not very long distances, right? These are not, certainly I'm in New York City right now. Certainly the distance is a lot less than from New York to Wisconsin, for instance. Yeah. And so you feel, And then the animosity in this particular war was quite acute. It wasn't, I mean, it was about sort of, you know, destroying the major capitals of the Western world or many places and committing those suicide attacks. But there was a particular hatred held for Persians, for the Shiites, and that's why the desecrations happened. So when I was there, you know, and you know, when you're in a landscape, because you know most soldiers don't see a lot of actual combat, as you know, and some see very much of it, but they're the few. But when you're in this type of a war where it's not major armies, you know, and it's pockets and urban warfare and you know, chase and you know, hunt, and the distances are practically sometimes you know, a couple of 100 yards away, and you can hear your enemy's call, Allahu Akbar, you know, and it puts chills in your spine, and it also makes you question a lot of things, because you and your cohort, you know, they, you know, call the prayer as well, you know, and it's more or less the same language and the same things are said. So it becomes a very murky world in very extremely close distances. My protagonist talks about, and of course this happened to me, like, you know, you'll be in a combat zone and you're using your SIM card from Tehran in Iraq to talk to somebody in Tehran. It's like really bizarre. You know, the nature of, as you well know, the nature of war has changed because of technology, because of social media. So, you know, you can be in places and you can be doing things that are stupid. You shouldn't be on your phone in the middle of a firefight, but you are, and you look around and everybody else is. It's very unprofessional.
Yeah.
And but that's what's happened. So I went on for a while. I forgot what the original question was.
It leads me into something else about how, you know, social media in some respects is also a weapon in the wars or in the conflicts that are going on now as well. I was at a conference. This was like 10 years ago, but it was a conference with international journalists. It was out in New York, and it was about war and covering conflict. And I remember talking to a journalist from Russia, and at that time, I think the Chechen, there was the Chechen rebels were going on in Chechnya. And the only reason why I bring this up is he said he covered an incident where a woman with a suicide vest had gone into a train station, like the platform, you know, like an underground subway, to blow herself up and to kill herself and to kill a bunch of people. But this was what I remembered about this is he said she made sure that she did it within sight of the camera, you know, the video camera that's down in the platform. Had she gone further away, there would have been greater loss of life, but it wouldn't have been caught on the video camera. And that video wouldn't, and so that's something it's because that's a weapon, that's a weapon just as much as an AK-47 in some respects, which that just kind of brought me up. Listen, I wanted to ask you one thing. There's a passage that you had pretty early in the book, and I thought this would be kind of a good thing to talk about, but you say, in this war, nothing at all made sense. People appeared and disappeared. Ancient animosities suddenly boiled over. Heads were cut off with such fierce regularity that it made you doubt the proper digits of your century. And there were so many sides and fronts and realignments that when you managed to grab a sliver of reliable internet long enough to read a foreign paper, where they referred to the simple men you had marched alongside as men who committed atrocities, you began to doubt everything, especially yourself. am I a part of this, of some beastliness? Do you think, is that something that the men and the women that are being part of this, do you think there's that self-reflection, or are you getting that because you're the journalist and you're kind of trained to self-reflect that way?
Very good question. No, it's a personal thing. I cannot talk for the Western combatants and armies, but the men you are with, they have had families killed, and a friend of mine was killed 3 days ago in Iraq, still fighting ISIS near Mosul. This guy had given me a ride to Baghdad one time. I just found out on Facebook. I wouldn't have known if I didn't go into Facebook. So these things are very personal, and these people, for them, it was a matter of saving, first of all, their country, because the assault was so quick, and it was such a blitzkrieg when it happened. It was pretty unbelievable, and they quickly had to, the call went out by the Grand Cleric Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, and they gathered formations. They don't have those reflections. They have pretty, they're pretty, not because they're not sophisticated people or anything like that, but they have a goal, and they're going to stick to it. But you, as you're a part of that machinery of defense or battle, but also you're an outsider. You're in and out, and that's what I've been all of my life. I've been an outsider, and as an immigrant in the United States, as a professor in New York City university system, but also I'm an outsider in a way when I go back to Iran, because I have that dual consciousness of various geographies. So yes, you do question yourself, but like in the novel, in those situations when people have to take somebody out, for instance, because that person was an enemy combatant and he committed these atrocities, they will do so. I mean, I will just extend this a little bit. I remember with my partner, there was that horrible massacre of Camp Spriker, if you remember. They I don't know, they like 1,600 soldiers to be were slaughtered, and my partner, one of the most important newspapers in the U.S. reported that they had talked to the only surviving person back then, but my partner had already talked with 6 people. Nobody saw that, but the guy talked about how systematically they slaughtered these people, cut off hands. These things are real. They're not fantasy. It's really hard to. It's easy to sit, thousands of miles away and judge certain things. But when you're in that situation, I couldn't judge these people, but I could judge myself, and the protagonist certainly judges himself or thinks about it in every way, and yeah.
Well, and Salar, is the protagonist you? Is this kind of an autobiographical thing? And if so, why did you decide to write a novel as opposed to a memoir?
It's not fully autobiographical. There are certainly things in there that are not me, but a lot of it is. And when I decided to go this route, I thought, let's do away with pretense, just choose a name that's close to your own, The address that the guy has in Tehran is exactly my address, I live across a synagogue in Tehran. And those sorts of things. And then there are other things that people I know experienced, or it was an amalgam of people, so the way fiction works. But why fiction is one of those philosophical questions. I wanted to write a nonfiction book. I thought, my blueprint for it was, I had watched Restrepo, and I had watched God rest his soul, Mr. Hetherington, Sebastian Junger's partner, do a 10-month gig, I think, in I think it was Korangal Valley. You probably know better, in South Afghanistan. One of the most difficult places on earth to do anything, let alone be shot at for 10 months straight. And I thought what they did and what they came out of there with was pretty amazing as a work of documentary. And my partner and I, that's the vision I had at first. And then things happened, and like life overtakes you. And this whole thing took a half a decade of my life in and out of these geographies. And in that half a decade, I was doing a lot of other things. I was not just a war correspondent. I was also the guy, writing art texts. I wrote like the person in the protagonist in the novel. I wrote a film script in Persian, and at the same time I was coming back to New York to teach, to teach creative writing. It was a very bizarre life, to say the least. Sometimes absurd. I have an essay where I talk about, my partner almost got killed in Iraq. I just got the word, and then like 5 minutes later, I have to come and sit with my graduate students, fiction graduate student workshop, and I have to, sort of draw the curtain on myself and become another human being. And I have to do that every moment of every day, not only in the US, but also in Tehran, because in Tehran, people didn't really care that much, except for the guys who were going to the front. So it can, I've talked about this at length, and also the protagonist talks about it. It can really be it can play mind games with you, and it does. And it manifests itself in different ways. But as far as fiction goes, I thought some people, they've been doing good work, nonfiction, pretty good work about how this war took place, good essays. Let me just sort of write about my own life in a way, but change things and about the people I know. And I wanted to write a very serious war novel. And it didn't quite come out that way. It's just like some places are kind of funny because, a war is also at the same time ridiculous. Like the things that happen are pretty ridiculous also.
Yeah. I think that's why books like Catch-22 and Slaughterhouse-5, I think that why those have become classics is because the authors there very adroitly addressed the pathos and the seriousness with the utter absurdity of what they were seeing and what was going on, and then just kind of like took it, like another.
Absolutely, yes.
Now I wanted to ask you, Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. That book plays in a way a kind of a character in your book. Can you kind of tell me and tell the viewers how you use that book in your book, Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, and why did you choose that?
Sure. Well, I love Marcel Proust. You know, I think what he did, his achievement as a writer is unequaled. And I read him very early on, you know, in my early 20s. And when I first went back to Iran to live for a few years, one of the things I took was the entire corpus of the Remembrance of Things Past, the whole translation.
Mm-hmm.
And I had underlined all of the places, and you can spend your whole life underlining Proust because there's so many amazing passages.
Mm-hmm.
So that sat in my friend's house in Tehran, and so save that for a minute. And then, you know, after a while of going back and forth to war, as you well know, having been there, you know, it's mostly just tedium of just sitting around in whatever, you know, these areas doing absolutely nothing and thinking that, well, I'll just read Proust because I have a lot of time to read Proust.
Mm-hmm.
But you end up not doing it actually, unless you're like maybe a soldier and you're there. But like if you're like us, you know, like you have things going on in your head. So I thought about the idea of, you know, some person taking Proust to read on the battlefront, and then and these things happen in a place like Iran, like bizarre things like that. And when then I thought about how to use it, how to use Proust, I went back, I wrote to my friend, I said to him, could you take photographs of all the pages where I underlined Proust in my mid-20s? And he did, and he sent it to me. And I used my underlines of, you know, decades back to sort of incorporate into this novel. And that's what fiction does, because first of all, Proust wrote at some length about war. Interestingly enough, you wouldn't think so unless you read the whole thing, because World War I was happening, and you know, Proust talks about, for instance, one of the passages that always stood in my mind was he talks about the tragedy of seeing soldiers during World War I coming home for breaks from the front, and seeing like that cafe society, Parisian cafe society, in their comfortable cafes sipping coffee, and you know that hunger in the eyes of these men who have seen hell. And I experienced that, and you know, I would go see soldiers in places like Bonn who, you know, like again, is something I've talked about, you know, like outside of war, they're kind of like invisible and unappreciated. And I myself would come, and, you know, Tehran is a big cafe society now. And I would sit with people I know, you know, artists, and you know, like, our worlds were so different, and they are today also, you know, like, you know, they had no idea where I had been or what I had done.
Mm-hmm.
They were not particularly that interested, and I didn't talk about it. And anger actually lay with me for a long time about that, sat with me for a long time, because again, it's about going back and forth between these worlds, and you know.
Yeah.
But Proust certainly helped the situation very much. I don't know if I answered, but there it is.
Well, it always, every time that I went to either Iraq or Afghanistan, it was always like, I would go, like, say when I would go to Afghanistan, I would fly from America to Dubai, and then to Dubai into like a, you know, Bagram Air Force Base or so. And then I would do that back out. So it was always like, so when you're in the war zone, it's sandstorms and it's, you know, under netting, there's bottles of water that are 100 degrees, you know, and you're thirsty and you could just dunk a, you know, tea bag in, you'd have a cup of tea, you know, and you're like, and then you go, you kind of back out from there, and then you get onto this transport, and then you're in Dubai with the gleaming whatever I wanted to eat or drink, and people dressed normally, and it was kind of like you would back out of war and then you would go into war, and it was just so, I would think to myself, well, 24 hours from now I'm going to be able to take a bath, you know, which is, whereas 24 hours earlier my bath was a box of wet wipes, and it was all that different, you know, of how do you move from one to the other. And I think that gets to what you were saying, is that it's just such a, it's kind of jarring almost, because as a reporter, it's generally just you, as opposed to the soldiers. They're on a transport, they're all together, they're coming back home. But very much it's, you know, you feel like you're going from one world, you know, you're going from Mars and you're going into Venus, or back and forth. That's what always what was like for me.
Yeah, Phil Clay, in one of his the great short story collection, the Redeployment, he has a story, I think, if I remember right, where, you know, he's been like, the character's been doing all this soldier work, and then, so, you know, next minute he's sitting in an airplane, like you say, and trying to, you know, fix the ear
nozzle.
Yeah, so that he can get air. And it's like, it's a real, like a discombobulation. And like, you know, one of the things you yourself wrote, and, you know, I recently read about, you know, the murder of James Foley. You know, like if you have known someone, and you know, they're killed, it's a whole different ball game. I have an essay where you know, I have a colleague who's from Israel, and you know, her nephew was killed in Gaza, and I knew the nephew from, you know, from her. She had told me, like, and the essay is about, you know, like about, you know, things change when you know someone, even if they're, you know, on the other side. That's why, as I was reading I was writing also, you know, empathy and like putting yourself in the position of the other. I knew as I was writing this piece, I mean, this novel, that the American writers that I read today, besides the great ones from the past, war writers, but there's been some really amazing writing of these wars, and from veterans who are also writers. I knew they would understand what I tried to do, even though it was from the other side, from the other point of view, and they did, and they've written to me about it, and it's been a very remarkable experience that way too.
Oh, that must be very rewarding.
Yes, very much, very much.
Yeah, I wanted to read a passage for you and for the viewers as well too, and this gets back to Marcel Proust. He talks about your protagonist talking about in Proust, and he finds the like half of a book of remembrance of things lost buried, and he pulls it out in your book, and he sees the you know, the underlined spots, and so he's trying to like figure out like why did this person underline these things, and who was this person. And so he's telling somebody about this, and he says, one character in Remembrance of Things Lost talks about how war is always in a state of becoming. It kind of means you can never win. No one can. War is perpetual motion. Even after it's over, you think you've won, then a few years later, your win turns into a loss. And once you enter combat, you've signed away anything good in this world. Men who don't understand this simple equation have a habit of turning the world to shit. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why did you want to use that passage, and how did you incorporate, you know, how did Marcel Proust help you get to that point?
I wrote that passage because it's true, you know. Oftentimes, people, men, it seems more often than not, make these decisions to go to war without having any idea what, you know, war is like. And there's a moment, there's a scene in this novel, for instance, where um, he's been kind of berated by the woman he loves, and she's with the theater crowd, and he's thinking, you know, they're going to shove another Samuel Beckett play up people's throat about, you know, wastelands and emptiness. What do they know about wastelands and emptiness? They should come to the town of Fiji in Iraq and see what absolute destruction looks like. And I want to see them do a play then. But war is really this way. I think it you know, once you start that it's like to me it's like a Greek tragedy. It just doesn't end. Like its cycles, you know, just sort of renew themselves, and it manifests itself in different ways. And when you look at the history of the Middle East and many parts of the world, you know, not to just say the blame is on colonialism or this or that, but when you look at what happened after World War I, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkanization of these countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, these places, the wars that ensued, you know, and it seems to never finish. It just sort of pops up its head in some fashion. And again, you know, the protagonist towards the very end talks about what actually happened this past week, you know. So you've done your war, you've done your duty as a soldier. And, you know, the American Marines who had to capture Fallujah, I talk about this in my last novel, who had to capture Fallujah twice, I'm sure they feel the same thing, you know, like they gave their blood, and for what? And who's in Fallujah, you know, a couple of years later, you know, and so you've been there and you've done that, and then you go into Facebook or whatever, and then the first thing you see is the guy who gave you a ride to Baghdad was killed in a firefight, and you thought the war was over. I didn't really think the war was over, but because these things never end, and they just sort of perpetuate themselves through things as reductive as vengeance, but you know, vengeance can take many forms, and it's really tragic.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that in your book, Americans are they're mentioned, but Americans are not, you know, the American troops that were in Iraq or we just sent more now to Syria. They announced this just last week. They're very much in the background. And can you talk a little bit about why that was a conscious decision on your part, not to mention the Americans or the American involvement that much?
Sure. As opposed to Tehran at Twilight, my last book, where one of the main themes or lines of the plot is a friendship between this Iranian writer and journalist again and a former Marine captain. This time I wanted to leave the Americans out and just sort of focus on the point of view of the other, but keeping this in mind that the Americans, the superpower who sort of, you know, began all of this atomic bomb of a situation that we've been now for 2 decades, they're a presence. They are there, but except, as you know very well, you mentioned Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan is a perfect example of that. you know, oftentimes, not always, oftentimes the Americans are in this bubble, as you know, and they're not really seen. They're just sort of a perfect metaphor for them would be the shades that the soldiers wear, you know, because of that sun and everything. You know, it's like they're not quite a presence, and they are at the same time very much a presence. You see their gunships, you know, you hear their jets, and I wanted them to be there, but I didn't want them to enter the actual plot line, because then it would complicate the story from this point of view. But I did want a Westerner in there, and so I brought this Frenchman towards the end of the novel, because there were guys like that, as you know, who just picked up, you know, they had to do something about ISIS, so they came and they joined. But usually they would join. I mean, always they would join the Kurdish forces. You know, nobody comes to join the Shiite militias, really. You really have to have an in with them to be able to do that sort of thing. But I put him in there because I wanted that Western thing also.
And I think when we talked a few days ago, you'd mentioned also that the American perspective of the Middle East wars has been told in other books as well too. Was that also one of the reasons why?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a nonfiction written, and also by non-Americans as well, but also like great fiction has been, you know, written. Kevin Powers' Yellow Birds, Redeployment that I just talked about, Roy Scranton, and so on and so forth. These are good writers, like very, very capable writers, whom I admire. And so I thought, you know, the story that has not been told is this story, is kind of my story and my people. And you know, now I'm seeing some feedback which is really interesting by people who approach, by guys usually who read the war novels for the war part of it. So when they see a literary war novel like mine, they're kind of, you know, they just want the war part of it. So when they write their things, they say, they give it the 5 stars, which is great. I'm grateful, but with reservations. They don't like the Proust part and all of that stuff, and the art stuff, but they appreciate getting the other's point of view. Like, these readers have never, you know, like when Shiite militias are mentioned in the news here, they're just this entity, like this, like a block. You know, we don't know who they are. They're human beings. They want to get married. They want to have children. You know, all of that stuff. So I try to put all of that in there. Like, who are these people who are going to war? Who are these people? You know, the guy who maybe he doesn't seek martyrdom, but he doesn't run from it, right? He's not a crazy guy. He believes in something, and sometimes he does it for a certain purpose. Sometimes he does it for another purpose. But we as sophisticated readers of books, followers of current events, should understand the nuances of these people rather than just think, oh, President so-and-so has decided to call this block of people who until yesterday were our allies in the fight against ISIS a terrorist organization. It's a little, it's not unexpected, but I consciously decided to write something that unpacks this.
Yeah. Salar, I want to go back to something you'd mentioned before, and then please, if people have questions, I've got one question so far, but please type in your questions. When you were talking about, you know, the Americans are this presence, but they're in kind of like a bubble, and, you know, that people knew where the bases were, and then they would see, you know, the convoys or maybe the helicopters or, you know, the gunships coming through. I remember one year I was traveling from Gardez to Khost in Afghanistan, and as I'm just looking out through the Humvee window, and I look off in the distance and I see this tiny girl, and the sun is just coming up, and I see this tiny girl, maybe about 6 years old, and she's tending a flock of goats. And I remember thinking to myself, I immediately thought of there was a famous National Geographic cover photograph of a girl in Afghanistan, and she's got these piercing eyes looking out at the camera. And it's people probably, if you're listening, and you probably can remember just that photo. Well, I remember reading 25 years later, that photographer tracked down that woman who was by now married, arranged marriage, and she had no idea. No, she didn't know what National Geographic was. She didn't know what magazines were. She had no idea that she was this iconic face. And I remember thinking, that was going through my mind as we were driving along, and I was looking out, and I looked at this little girl, and she's looking at these convoys of, you know, Humvees and MRAPs going by. And I thought, what is she thinking? What does she think this is? Does she know who Americans are? Does she know where you know, it just kind of brought up the whole thing of, I would love to know what's in a lot of people's minds over there when they see the Americans in Afghanistan, and it's in a small, you know, country. What's kind of going through their mind? Anyway, I just wanted to mention that it just kind of brought to mind something that I thought of. We've got a question from Patricia, who says, when you've been in war zones, do you find yourselves gravitating toward other journalists and photographers just to find some common ground with someone?
No, and also the places I go, as I noted, journalists just don't come. Like, you will not really see Western journalists hanging out for long periods of time with Kataib Hezbollah. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
But and also the protagonist talks about that. He talks about where a lot of journalists, you know, like to file their stories from. It's, you know, Beirut, Istanbul, you know, these cosmopolitan cities. You know, you can go to your war, and in the afternoon you can go have a, you know, drink, you know. Mm-hmm. No, I don't gravitate at all to other journalists. Not that, you know, I'm it's just because, like, that's not the job I do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and as for me answering that question, on my 8 trips to war zones, twice I went with photographers. The rest of the times I was by myself, and sometimes I would come into a zone, and maybe another reporter from the New York Times or USA Today or Stars and Stripes, they would gather us together, because then they would, you know, send us out on helicopters from there, and then you might spend a night, you know, just chatting with people. But I wasn't with anybody else. I was embedded with Wisconsin National Guard troops, and I was the only one there, or a photographer that was with me. So we didn't tend to, like, gravitate towards each other. It wasn't like Vietnam, where, you know, here where, you know, Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam, they would all hang out at the Caravel Bar. That's just not the way, that's just something that just doesn't happen, at least in Iraq or Afghanistan, which, you know, that was fine with me. So that's the only question that we've got. One thing I did want to ask you, are you, one of the characters in your book is somebody who works for the state, who's a handler, can you talk a little bit about H and what his role is? And because I wanted to segue that to find out, like, are you going to get in trouble back home in Iran for writing this book?
I don't really think much about these things. Age, the state interrogator, is actually kind of a cool guy. You know, he turns to Proust and starts quoting from him. I wanted to, you know, a lot of all until now, until recently, you know, whenever nonfiction or fiction has been written about a place like Iran, they make it sound like this, again, this entity, which is like pure, you know, evil or just one big prison house. Well, you know, I live there a lot of the year and it's not like that at all. I want, you know, my job as a fiction writer, as a writer in general, is to convey human beings in all their nuances and dimensions. You can be an interrogator and actually have feelings like books. It doesn't necessarily make you a good person or a bad person. Who knows how you got that job and what you do with that job. You know, these are all questions. Like, I think here, people are so removed from being in those situations that, you know, instantly they think, oh my goodness, wow, you know, what happened? And because here people think that way, people over there who experience these situations get some mileage out of it. Oh my God, you know, they kept me for half a day, you know, they interrogated me for 4 hours. Well, so they did, you know, it happens sometimes, you know, it's not a good thing, but it happens. So I thought, you know, having experienced that myself and, you know, having been, you know, having actually, you know, in Iran is a place where you can have a literary discussion with your interrogator quite often, or the guy from Ministry of Censorship, because he basically, like, you guys are haggling, like, why did you put that word in there? Well, you know, it's not so bad, you know, it's like, and then at times you think, my God, you know, I'm a writer, who reads anymore in this day and age? But this guy, he read my book, like, you know, the guy said to me, you know, Mr. Abdoh, we have chewed every sentence of your book, but hey, you know, somebody did that for me. I'll take that. You know, so, you know, I wanted a character who's not all, you know, who's not a cardboard character of a, you know, of an evil person, but somebody who has feelings. Maybe they have aspirations to be someone else, you know. So that's why I created H. As I said, a lot of these people, these characters, did not come out of a vacuum. There was some history behind it.
Meg, Salar, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you both so much for the evening. What an honor. I hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you to everyone for being here, for watching us tonight, for joining in, because we wouldn't have a bookstore virtual down on Downer Avenue. Either way, we wouldn't have it without you. So thank you both. And
thank you so much. Thank you, Meg. Thank you,
my
Chris.
pleasure getting a chance.
Let's be in touch.
All right, you're on it.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Chris.
All right,
thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.